Greetings, all. Thanks for joining us tonight in beautiful downtown Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, near the campus of Bucknell University, for this webinar on restoring the lost art of disagreement, featuring Professors Bret Weinstein and Heather Heying. I'm Paul Sievers, Associate Professor of Literary Studies at Bucknell, here with my colleague, Professor Chris Ellis of Political Science. Tonight's program is part of a series on bridging divisions in American life. For more details on this and upcoming events, please see bucknellleaders.org. That's bucknellleaders.org, one word. Tonight's program focuses on how the ability to disagree thoughtfully and critically is in danger in American higher education. We hope to address how this can be remedied. Our guests will speak for maybe about 20 minutes together on their experiences with this problem, and then we'll converse about what can be done to solve it. We'll have time for questions and answers from the audience, hopefully, which you can enter during the program on the Q&A tab on the Zoom webinar frame. Our speakers tonight are Bret Weinstein and Heather Heying, former professors at Evergreen State College, who taught there from 2004 to 2017, when the administration pressured them to leave following protests. Since then, they've become known as outspoken advocates of free speech, nationally participants in the intellectual dark web, and hosts of the Dark Horse podcast. Currently, they are fellows at the James Madison Program for American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. Thanks so much to both of you for being with us. And perhaps you can start with a little background on your journey toward becoming nationally prominent advocates of free speech and thoughtful discourse.
Sure. Well, thanks for having us.
Thank you indeed.
So let me start by catching people up on what took place at Evergreen. It is, of course, a very complex story, and we could spend all the time and much more covering it, so I will just deal with the bare bones version. But I would like to put it in a context. I'm going to come back at the end to a concept that I would call the special nature of zero. That won't mean anything to you yet, but I'm going to try and place Evergreen in that context in the end. Heather and I are going to talk back and forth on the issue, but the problem started in earnest in 2016 as the new president of Evergreen impaneled a committee to investigate racial bias on campus. And this committee set about creating a description of what it claimed was the problem and a set of proposals that were supposed to remedy it. And as this committee did its work, it became increasingly clear that the diversity, equity, and inclusion plans that it had for the campus were quite wrong-headed and, in fact, a critical danger to the ability of the college to continue doing what it did well, and they were going to be an obstacle to fixing the things that the college didn't do so well. So it was our job. Heather and I were both tenured professors at Evergreen. Heather was literally Evergreen's most popular professor, which is very clear in the online reviews that you can still see on Rate My Professor. But in any case, it was our job to review proposals. Governance was part of the deal, and so we looked very carefully at these proposals, and we did what we were supposed to do, which was to raise questions. Now, Heather went on sabbatical and became less directly involved in this, but we were both quite alarmed, and I started attending every single faculty meeting because there were radical additions added at every step. And at the same time, what objections I could raise in person became fewer and fewer as the opportunity to raise objections was eliminated. And I, at that point, took to the email list on campus, the staff and faculty email list, on which there were something like 500 students who had work-study jobs. But in any case, my point was very clear, that these proposals were themselves a threat to the college, and they were not going to aid the populations they were ostensibly designed to help. And
furthermore, a threat to a liberal arts curriculum in general.
Yes.
Right? To the very ethos of what it is that higher ed is supposed to be doing.
In fact, they would be the death knell to such an education. That the idea that that Heather and I had found at the center of our teaching, which was the arming of students with tools taken from Enlightenment traditions that would allow them to navigate any career going forward, that those tools were being sidelined in favor of effectively indoctrination. The raising of objections, however, caused me in particular to become the essentially public enemy number one. I was labeled a racist, which I saw coming. It was clear that that was going to happen. I also thought at the time that the accusation in my case was so preposterous in light of the life that I had led that the accusation would simply not stick. There was a specific proposal around which much of the narrative has focused, a proposal for an alteration to a tradition at the college called Day of Absence, in which in past years people of color, originally it was black student, staff, and faculty, but it became people of color more generally, absented themselves from the college for one day in order to highlight the roles that they had played at the college. And in 2017, the proposal was advanced that white people stay away from campus. And I saw a huge difference between absenting oneself from campus to make a point and telling other people to stay away from a public college on the basis of their skin color. So I objected. I said so on email, and I said that I intended to be on campus that day. It created the expected firestorm. And on May 23rd of 2017, 50 students that I had never met showed up at my classroom and accused me of racism and demanded my resignation or my firing. They took video of the incident in which I tried to reason with them. That video they then uploaded to the net. It was eventually moved to YouTube and became almost instantly well known. And in any case, that preceded the campus descending into riots and literal anarchy for a week. The president of the college stood down the campus police. There
was assault and battery by students of other students.
By students of other students. Student patrols were set up. They roved the campus armed. They hunted, apparently, for me, according to the campus police. And in any case, I won't go into more detail, but that's the basic description of what took place. Do you want to jump in at this point?
Yeah, I guess this is a good place to talk about the fact of 50 students whom you had never met, and again, I was on sabbatical, but whom I had also never met, showed up at your classroom. And it was clear, not in the moment, but it was clear in retrospect that one of the things that the protesters who showed up expected and completely assumed was that Bret's students would defect. Right, that they would turn on him and join their student peers, that the alliance was with students, and no matter how crazy the suggestion, in this case, your professor's a racist, that they would join the other students in the mob against him. And for Bret, as it was for me later, and it was true for us the entire time that we were teaching, the thought never would have entered our minds that our students would have turned on us, because the classrooms that we established were exactly not those sorts of classrooms. And so in speaking directly to the title here, Restoring the Lost Art of Disagreement on College Campuses, this is in fact exactly what we were doing. So we're scientists. We were teaching science, evolutionary biology, animal behavior, vertebrate evolution, all stuff around biology, including a lot of field studies. And it may often seem that the sciences in particular are taught as a litany. You have to get through a certain number of things. There's no time to veer. The curriculum is set. And I would argue, and I have argued, and I will persist in arguing, that this is actually a big part of the problem. That you have science students ever more bubbled in their little enclaves and not being taught actually what the scientific method is. And you have a takeover over in the humanities, which are absolutely imperative for us as humans and for the liberal arts tradition, but you have a takeover by this postmodern tradition that doesn't fundamentally believe in reality. And so what we would do in our classrooms, Brett and I sometimes taught together, we often taught separately. We have very different styles, but we had very similar kinds of content that we would teach. And what we were exactly doing was fostering disagreement. We would start every class, not every single day of class, but every program, by trying to hand away our authority, by saying, there is no reason that you should trust me simply because I'm the one with the degree who has been hired to stand up here and talk at you and deliver unto you a narrative evaluation at the end. We didn't have grades, we had narrative evaluations. I need to earn not just your respect, but actually, at some level, your faith over iterative interactions that I actually know something and have an ability to teach you, and that I am worth listening to. And no, you probably shouldn't maintain that level of skepticism for months and months and months. Either I do come to earn your trust and respect, and you do start to listen to me with more trust, or you don't, and you go elsewhere. But don't. This is not a binary system. You trust the professor or you don't trust the professor. We have to learn to interact with people as we have the engagements with them. And this was possible at Evergreen in part because of the model. And so in terms of how do we foster disagreement on campuses, it's hard in part because of the model of higher ed that has become dominant. At Evergreen, as much as it's easy to malign it and it's become this sort of laughing stock of what can go wrong in higher ed, it was a brilliant and beautiful experiment for liberal arts for many, many years. I was there for 15 years, you were there for 14 years, and what you could do was extraordinary in part because we had full-time programs. And so whereas if you're at a traditional college where you are teaching 2, 3, 4, 5 classes at a time as faculty, and some of those classes might have hundreds of students, you can't actually know every single one of your students. But we could. So we were teaching a full-time program, that means the expected workload for the students is 40 hours a week. We were supposed to have 16 hours of contact time a week. We would spend, in our final program together, we did an 11-week study abroad in Ecuador when we were with the students all the time, and we did domestic field trips as well. And we had 50 students, and then we had 30 in Ecuador. You can know 50 students, actually, and you can know 30 students, and you can know something about all of them. Certainly you can know all of their names, but you can know something intriguing about all of them, something from their development, something that they are aspiring to, and help them figure out who they want to be. And it's this tendency of faculty to treat students like their brains in jars, and all of their personal development is the job of student affairs or their friends or the party. They're going to learn that stuff in the parties off campus in non-COVID times. That is part of the problem, I would say.
So to make this a little bit clearer, when you're teaching full-time, a single program, a single room full of students, and those students are taking exactly one class, which we called programs at a time, what it allows you to do is actually build a culture together. And that means that not only do you know the names of students and know something about them, but you also know a lot about how they think, where their blind spots may be, what combinations of students might work well together. And I think the thing that's hardest for us to convey is that in light of that kind of community, what unfolded around us over the various diversity, equity, and inclusion proposals was simply bizarre. And the reason that none of our students defected was that they knew us very, very well, and the accusation that was being leveled made no sense. Now, apparently, what we probably should have known but didn't was that there were places in the college that didn't have such a culture, and therefore what they expected at the point that they created this protest was that people would respond to the optics of it, and that they would join it because they were students and it was students protesting, and protesting a professor would make sense. But the fact that none of them defected really tells the story.
And a mob coming face to face with a professor who is appropriately confident that he is not a racist and does have compelling and real relationships with his students, the mob doesn't know what to do. So the mob responds by escalating, as it did. And obviously a functional system of higher ed needs an administration that can stand strong against any mob mentality. And students need to be willing to step outside of their own comfort zones and try on ideas that they've never tried before and listen to ideas that may seem outside of what they have permitted themselves to think before. But frankly, administration and students, I think, should be an easier sell, as hard as crazy as that may sound, because administrations, frankly, are often the most cemented in place. But if I have to pick of the sort of three constituencies that are easiest to name in higher ed, administration, faculty, and students, as to which one should be holding the reins here and has the power to turn this thing around, it's the faculty. That it is the faculty who are actually being cowardly and refusing to be in front of their students with any kind of humility, frankly, in part, but also, and I think that the lack of humility is covering an actual lack of confidence. That if you are willing to go with students to the borders of what you think you know, and to go beyond it and say, let's explore, I don't know. Wow, I hadn't thought of that before. Whether it's from this text or this experiment, or it doesn't matter what it is that you're teaching. Oh, this thing that we're doing in the classroom or in the field or in the lab, whatever it is, took us to a place I didn't expect. Great, let's go. Let's see what happens next. And sometimes it's going to reveal, oh, actually, we ended up at a dead end. We're going to have to backtrack to the last fork in the road and take a different direction. I don't know. I'm going to have to go think on it and get back to you. Someone else in the room knows more than I do. Please take the floor. Let's see what happens. That requires time, for one thing, which most traditional higher ed systems don't allow, right? That if you've got 50 minutes 3 days a week or something, there's not a lot of opportunity for that. But it also requires a kind of combination of confidence in your ability to navigate complex conversations with students, and again, the humility to be able to say in front of your students, interesting, I don't know, let's see if we can figure it out together.
All right, now I'd like to take just a minute or two to come back to this question of why 0 is a special number and what implications it has for challenging these sorts of wrong-headed proposals in a college context. The idea is this. There can't be any colleges that successfully resist these initiatives, because if there were, whatever colleges managed to resist would instantly move to the head of the pack with respect to their capacity to teach students and their prestige, right? If Harvard is going to misinform its students by selling them indoctrination rather than enlightenment, and some other college anywhere figures out how to avoid this, then that will be the place to send your kids. So it must be true that this thing will sweep over all colleges. And so far, this is exactly what we are seeing, right? The number of colleges that successfully resist has to be 0 or the whole thing won't work. So what I would expect is that whatever needs to occur in order for whatever college you happen to be at to fall prey to this and fail to fend it off will happen. And so when looking at what took place at Evergreen, it is important to recognize, yes, it was early. Yes, it was more dramatic than most. Yes, it was captured on film in a way that few will be. But in some ways, this was just perfectly generic. And it isn't just colleges. It will also be corporations, schools of ed. It will be all of the important institutions. And that is the thing we are up against. And that's going to take some careful thinking to escape it.
I guess I'd like to say one more thing, which that was a perfect capstone to the conversation. I'm going to insert something. So imagine this is happening 5 minutes earlier.
Sorry about that.
No. The one thing that was present in our classrooms, which you might expect to see more often in lower ed classrooms, was a sense of play and playfulness. And in fact, we would often, literally take, even if we weren't in the field, but literally take the class outside if the day was good, and throw the frisbee around to demonstrate something, or even just to build community, and then to go back into circle and talk about whatever the text was of the day, whatever the ideas were that we were talking about. That this constant breaking out into play, actual physical play, helps form a culture of intellectual play as well. And this is, of course, what this is what the Socratic tradition is supposed to be about. This is what seminar is supposed to be about. But too often, those things in their modern instantiations look like people standing up and speaking from authority of the text or from their own lived experience, right? And just sort of putting something out there, and then someone responds, and everyone is very serious and making sure not to hurt anyone's feelings. And if you think about what we are, humans literally have the longest childhoods of any species on the planet. And what childhood is learning how to be the adult that you will become. And we are so much, this is a point that we make all the time, we are so much more software than hardware. We are so flexible and labile in what we can become, and playing with ideas, playing with physical objects, playing and having a sense of playfulness in the classroom and in your life, and inculcating that in students, I think, is another way to sort of sneak in the idea that disagreement is something that will sometimes happen. You're going to have conflict, you're going to have disagreement, and it's okay because the stakes were low. We're playing here. And yes, there are going to be times when the stakes are high, but let's do this education thing in a framework in which we have built trust, and so the stakes are low.
It also provides a much bigger landscape for students to demonstrate insight, right? In a classroom, we tend to have a very limited set of metrics, and the ability for somebody to reveal who they are in a different context is, it would be hard to overstate how important that is.
Absolutely.
All right. I think we may have arrived at the end of our remarks. Do you want to pose some questions or set up a discussion?
Sure. I mean, I can. And audience members, please chime in the Q&A or the chat. We can talk. So what happened at Evergreen was 4 years ago, and I remember reading about it and seeing it at the time and thinking this was just okay. It's a weird hippie college in the Coast. But it seems like a lot of this has transferred to other places and more mainstream places. And like you said, not just colleges, but institutions and corporations. So what do you, I guess, just open for discussion. What do you make of what's happened over the past few years in terms of your experience and how it's been, I guess, maybe been transferred to other places?
Well, one thing to say is that it was completely predictable. The fact is, students go to college. This particular style of thinking had been, I would say, festering in the academy for decades. It gained enough of a toehold, gained enough adherence that it detected that it had the power to shift things. But the idea that this was going to stop at colleges does not pay proper heed to the fact that people go to college and then they move into the workforce. And
it's precisely the point. I'm sorry for interrupting you, but what is the point of education if you really imagine that upon graduation, the students forget everything that they just learned and become like they were when they started, right? Of course, they take what they learned out into the world.
Right. And so in some sense, the lesson is the mistake was, back in the 90s at the point that we began creating phony fields and awarding them credibility, and then this was the inevitable outgrowth. At the point that this happened to us, I think were caught off guard by how quickly it took over our college and, the fact that it had the power effectively to drive us out. But the idea that there was something wrong and that it had been brewing in the university system was clear to us since we were undergraduates.
Yeah, I guess one other thing I would say is that what we saw at Evergreen, and what I've heard anecdotally from other faculty at other colleges who are watching the same thing happen in their institutions, is that the bane of faculty everywhere is having to do governance, is having to sit on committees, right? And so faculty in general will try to minimize those expectations for themselves if they can. And what we started to see before we really understood what was going on was that the newly hired faculty from what Bret calls the phony fields, the grievance studies fields, the fill-in-the-blank studies fields, were raising their hands and saying, yes, I'll be on that committee. I'll be on the hiring committees. I'll be on the committees that help decide the fate of the college. And so in so doing, we should believe them when they say to us, the postmodernists, that it's all about power. That this is exactly what they do. And so there was an accumulation.
Can you please the phony fields? I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, right? I when I talk about this in class, anything that ends in studies, and I think you already pointed in that direction. What do you mean by that, and how does that relate to the things you've been talking about?
Well, it's the things that end in studies, and I would say also things that without cause end in theory. So the idea is that there is a lost canon of the philosophy of science that says very specific things about how it is that theories come into being, right? One cannot propose a theory, one can propose a hypothesis, and then there are very clear rules for how it becomes a theory, what must be true of it in order for it to attain that status. So in these fields, what you will find is there is no method. What there are is assertions, right? There is the establishment of a culture, which is basically an agreement to accept these things and to build out the so-called field by proposing things that seem to fit with it. But what there is not is any mechanism to see whether it's true. And in fact, if you challenge one of these fields, if you say, all right, where is the evidence that X is true, then you're told that actually asking for evidence is the problem. Right? And so at the point that somebody says, well, those tools you got from the Enlightenment, they are oppressive. The evidence that you are looking for is an indication that you don't get it, right? The point is, oh, I get it. This is a Kafka trap, right? This is not the study of anything. It is the assertion of something.
Yeah, and the fields tend to be, the fill-in-the-blank fields, the fill-in-the-blank studies tend to be centered around some immutable or at least demographic characteristic, as opposed to a lens with which to view the world, an approach to the world, which framing your interests around I'm curious about political science or about literature or about biology is, yes, a more traditional way of understanding the world, but it's also more expansive than saying I'm going to view everything that I see through the fact of being female or the fact of being Black or Latino or gay or whatever it is. It is more expansive. It allows for more connections and frankly more connections between ideas, but also between people.
So I should also just, in closing on that point, say all of these things could in principle be studied, but if you were going to do so honorably, you would do so using methods that would allow you to decide which ideas were actually correct and which ones might seem correct but turn out to be false. Without that, these things just become self-reinforcing dogma.
Fair enough. That makes sense. Talk about gender studies does not have a biology requirement. It's a little bit strange.
It is
one more question for me, and then I'll turn it over to a bunch of really good questions from our audience. So this has become, a lot of this discussion has become unfortunately politicized, right? And so you start to see politicians on the right seizing on your case or similar cases, things like that, as a way to do just really bizarre things and trying to interfere with higher education, and particularly with state-related colleges, trying to get them to do things or not do things. And so I'm wondering how we deal with that, right? That it's fairly, I mean, I think your case is different, but then we start to look at these things from a very politicized lens and a left-right lens and a cultural war lens, and that's when I think this conversation breaks down. So as people who I don't know to be on the right, if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of how we work forward from this, given the let's say the polarization around higher education right now.
Well, I think there is one very simple lesson from our experience. So we definitely come from the left. We remain on the left. I've certainly learned things. I've certainly met a tremendous number of conservatives. We now circulate very easily with them, but it has not changed our position. And in fact, we can check it with the political compass test, for example. You can go and just check out what this method does, and we remain where we were.
Let me just say that some people on the right have made the claim that we must be on the right because of what we've now seen. And our position has always been, no, actually, we were on the left from first principles, right? Like, we were on the left because of political ideals, not because it was a social tribe. And the social tribe on the left has, unfortunately, I would say, a very small minority, but an increasingly loud and powerful minority that's making no sense at all. And that was never our tribe. And we were never hanging out over in that territory for social reasons anyway. It was about ideas. So, yeah, we are on the left. And that's part of what makes the Evergreen story difficult to dismiss, because it isn't just another, campuses are hostile to conservatives, which should be a huge story and is a big problem. But actually, that's not the story. It's that campuses are hostile to ideas that they don't like.
They're hostile to anybody who stands up against this, irrespective of where they come from. But the really useful thing is that because we do constitute a kind of counterexample, because we come from the left, are not embarrassed about it, know what we believe and why, we are now able to interact with folks on the right. And in fact, there is a very important discussion to be had. There are things that folks on the right have had correct that those on the left have trouble seeing, and vice versa. And the really important thing is to be able to compare notes and say, that there is something to the idea of the use of markets to solve certain kinds of problems, but here's where those markets fail, right? That's a very important discussion to have. Or that, conservatives tend to think things are fairer than they actually are, and seeing the unfairness overclaimed is completely counterproductive. But the ability to enter into such a discussion and say, in fact, there are structural problems, and what population you are born into has way too much predictive effect on how well you're going to succeed. But that doesn't actually require that racism lurks in every white skull. It can happen through other mechanisms. So there's a very important discussion just waiting to happen. And if people are willing to see that not everything that triggers the mob is conservative, we will get there much sooner.
Mm-hmm.
I just had a quick question, and then maybe Chris will take us to the good questions coming in. But just to follow up on that, it seems like there are terms that are used on campuses, especially in recent years, just to shut down any even constructive or thoughtful discussion, particularly the label of racist, transphobic, some terms like that. Obviously, those are terms that are serious charges. They involve history and tragedy and important issues. But on the other hand, I think it's John McWhorter, who's a linguist at Columbia University, is working on a book project where he talks about this sort of language shutting things down as really harming progressivism. I think that's part of the subtitle of the book that he's working on, that it cheapens the terms while it also shuts down the opportunity to critically examine issues related to those terms too. I was just wondering if you might have some further thoughts on that. How do we get beyond the use of these labels to unfairly shut down discussion, which seems to be a problem today?
Well, the first thing to realize is that the weaponization of these terms very often has a pattern to it. And the first time you hear the term white supremacy abused or racism, you don't know what's happening, right? These are familiar terms, and they're being used in an unfamiliar way. It is important to recognize that many of them have taken the form of a Mott and Bailey. A Mott and Bailey is a circumstance where a term has two meanings, and those who are deploying it in a weaponized form will dodge between them in a way that leaves them protected. They will use a secure definition when challenged, and they will use an extreme definition when they are on the move. And once you see that this is what's taking place, you know that you have an obligation to stand firm in the face of it, right? That trying to juggle the new definition doesn't work, because there isn't a new definition. There are multiple definitions. And I will just say, I gave a talk some years ago. The title is How the Magic Trick is Done. was my first attempt to sort of systematize how these tricks work and how to at least understand them. And it may be dated at this point, but it is worth thinking in that way.
I guess just one more thing at the individual level. These terms, as you say, Dr. Sievers, are have historical importance, and certainly the one that has been hurled most often, racist. No one has any interest in being thought of as or called a racist, and so it's a very powerful weapon if it's going to be used as a weapon as opposed to an actual description of truth. And so I think most good liberals and most good people live in some fear, whether or not they know it, at least if they're in this milieu where they are hearing these kinds of things charged, of it coming for them, of themselves being accused of such a thing. And if you know in your heart of hearts that you are in fact not a racist, and it happens that you get called that, as happened to both of us as Evergreen was melting down, it is kind of remarkable what happens. And, we referred to many parts of what happened to us as going through the looking glass, but you sort of come out the other side and go, well, I checked, not a racist, and I survived. I'm still standing. And now guess what? The power of that term has dissipated, at least when used against me, because as it turns out, you're just wrong. And the fact that you would say that against someone who has no racism in them demonstrates that actually you're probably the problem and not me.
And one approach is to say to your interlocutors, surely we can agree that a racist would have to be rooting for one race to succeed. A white supremacist would have to want white people to win out. Somebody who wants a fair system that doesn't care about your skin, we can argue about whether or not they know what they're talking about, but that term does not naturally apply. And if you say that and there's resistance, then the point is, okay, well, I know why you're resisting. It's not because there's any ambiguity in whether I meet that definition. It's because you're trying to fashion that definition, that term, into something it was never meant to be, right? And so I think that might be an important defense.
That's good. So a couple questions from our audience, which I think are pretty good. I'll start with this one. Do you think the current political climate in the United States has contributed to the past events that occurred at Evergreen? And what specific actions can we take in order to prevent them from happening again?
Well,
A lot there.
yeah, there is a lot there.
Yeah.
I would say one thing is, do they contribute? Of course. But they are not causal in the way that they are typically portrayed. And in fact, this is one of the ways that the magic trick is done, is that there is a provocation delivered in order to get a response, and then the response is isolated and imagined to be causal or claimed to be causal. Mm-hmm. And so we know what was taking place at Evergreen before Donald Trump was elected, for example, but everything is placed on Donald Trump. Likewise, I am somehow accused of having brought right-wing violence to Evergreen. Now, there was no right-wing violence brought to Evergreen. There was a phone call by somebody who claimed to be armed and coming to the campus that was made by a person 3,000 miles away who didn't own a firearm. It was a scary event. The campus was evacuated. But nonetheless, there's an inversion of cause and effect or a conflation that is clearly cynical. And the simple recognition that the place where the video starts doesn't necessarily tell you what initiated something, but often there is evidence if you go looking for it. And the fact is, these belief systems were on the march for years ahead of time, and then Trump was elected and much was placed at his doorstep.
Yeah.
Here's a good one. What are some suggestions for how campuses can deal with these sorts of issues? So if we want to, lost the question right now, but if we want to expand diversity and inclusion, but don't want to do it in the way the campuses seem to be doing it, what is the way to do it?
You want to take that, or?
I guess one thing is that most of what is flying under the banner of diversity, equity, and inclusion right now is not that. It seems like a false flag. We have a friend, actually, Chloe Valdery, who runs a course called Theory of Enchantment, and she has actually started doing some diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops. I don't know if she's done any on campus yet, but she's done some for corporate trainings, and I would love to be in one of her trainings. Like, she is actually interested in inclusion and diversity and openness and community and actually allowing everyone to reach their full potential. And, and she reaches people through true inclusion rather than through the kind of, banal barbarism that a lot of the campus stuff is experiencing right now.
Likewise, Irshad Manji.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
In any case, so I think the short version of that is there are probably at least several honorable versions of something you might call diversity, equity, and inclusion that you could bring on board because it would be useful to the campus and because it would immunize the campus against the phony version. But this is it's a difficult. It's a difficult thing because of this issue of 0 being a special number, right? There will be pressure applied until all campuses succumb in one way or another because the whole thing doesn't stand unless they all do.
Well, it's also difficult, again, because of some of the sort of inner machinations of higher ed, which will be of little interest to those outside of higher ed, but actually I think has importance that has spidered out to all of us, which is that I don't have any idea what has happened at Bucknell, but at Evergreen we know intimately, and at several other schools where I have talked with people about what has happened. Basically, you get a rise in the diversity, equity, inclusion class of administrators. And you get someone appointed to the vice president level, where used to be there was a vice president of academics and of student affairs, and of the physical plant, and maybe of money getting. And now you've got someone in charge of this thing that requires that not only is there now a problem across campus with racism and sexism and transphobia and all of these isms, but that there always will be, because as more and more people are hired into these positions, as these things grow, they need to keep their jobs. They need to retain the very parts of the budget that they have grabbed a piece of, and so it's actually not in their interest to solve the problem. And so hiring, in part hiring in this case, usually I would not be an advocate for hiring consultants for things on campus, but hiring someone like Theory of Enchantment to come in and do something wherein if they succeed, that's wonderful, and if they fail, that's terrible. But either way, the organization that's been hired and brought in doesn't have a perverse incentive to fail so that they keep their job going.
We've read Max Weber, so that's exactly.
Yeah.
Here's a question that may relate it back to a campus issue. Some people in Greek life, and about half of Bucknell students who are in fraternities and sororities, feel as though it's a very unequal organization. What do you think about this? If it's unequal, how can it be changed, and how can these organizations further diversity? So we can talk about fraternities and sororities, but I think also, I guess, campus clubs in general, and that kind of question.
Yeah, that's a tough one because there is obviously an inherently exclusionary nature there. And I would say, I, to be honest, don't know what the ultimate purpose of these organizations are and whether or not they have a place in the future. But what I would love to see is us to recognize what the positive version of exclusive or exclusivity is. In other words, there are many processes that are highly capable but fragile. Science is such a process. What that means is that you have to have ground rules posted at the door that allow this fragile, excellent process to unfold. And so if these institutions take themselves seriously, I think they will figure out what it is that truly elevates people who join and abandon superficial features that tend to cause people to gain interest and embrace features that will cause, a race to the top, as it were, of these organizations. I would love to see that. Other than that, I'm not sure I know enough about what goes on inside the organizations to even comment.
Yeah, I agree.
There's another one. There seems to be a recent rise in the idea of cancel culture, especially on college campuses. How can we break the cycle to get back to an open discourse?
Well, I think, this one is so perplexing, and I think it's especially perplexing for us because, as Heather pointed out, what we built in our classrooms was a culture in which you were perfectly safe to take a risky position, follow it to its logical conclusion, discover it was wrong, say, hey, I didn't get that right, and reorient. All of these things were something that was a regular feature of our teaching lives. And so the idea of a world in which people are looking out for somebody to utter a set of syllables and then that's going to be enough to denounce them and get them fired and all of these things is it's so obviously a self-destructive process that in some sense the real answer has to be, you don't want the world that results when everybody is on a hair trigger looking for who to, drive to the fringes of the town. That's not where you want to be. You want to be in a culture where people are free to contribute what they believe they know, to discover it's wrong. All of these things are the secret sauce to a truly enlightened and robust civilization. And if you want to make a fragile civilization, the way to do it is to build it with cancel culture. So everybody knows exactly what they're supposed to think and nobody deviates from those lines. And if they do, they keep it inside the confines of their skull. So really, this is a confrontation that we have to have so that we can continue into the future. Because if we allow cancel culture to rule, we are effectively opening the door to competitors that care a lot less about things like freedom and equality than we do.
It's also true that the culture, far larger than what's happening on campuses, has a problem. And COVID makes it all the worse. So put aside the particular nightmare that we're all collectively living through right now with regard to losing connection with people. But even basic and utterly fundamental and necessary relationships are disappearing. With the words like friend and like that have become cheapened by social media, and actual relationships that have been cheapened, frankly, with things like hookup culture and hiding behind screens, and having students who show up on campus who may never have been allowed to take risks because they underwent a parenting style that is in vogue now and prevented them from ever being exposed to risk. And add to that heady stew already a lot of people being on legal pharmaceuticals that disrupt their ability to regulate their own mood or to know who they are. And of course you have a lot of people who will pile on and who will say, I can't take that, that hurts me, I cannot accept that thing that you said is true, and it feels good to be in a mob, and frankly, so little else feels good. I don't have real relationship, I don't have real connection. Being part of a mob is fleeting, and it's exhilarating, and it causes an adrenaline rush, and it hurts afterwards. And presumably many of the people in those mobs feel bad about themselves afterwards, but that doesn't help in the moment when it's time to join one.
So along those lines, what is your advice to students or other faculty who are being attacked in a hostile, unprofessional manner in the academy over their political or social views?
Well, I
hope that someone has your back.
Yes,
first.
I think actually Heather's last answer is the key, is that you need to establish relationships in which somebody knows you well and is capable of giving you a reality check and doesn't fear that somebody might overhear it. And those relationships will make you stronger and clearer headed in the face of such things. But I also want to say I'm beginning, I had a kind of answer to this. People ask me all the time because of the incident at Evergreen, which they've encountered on YouTube. They want to know if they should stand up. And I have until now been very reluctant to tell them to, not because I don't want them to, and not because I don't think that they should, but because I don't want responsibility for the harm that will come to them if they do stand up. And I believe that that's a real risk. In other words, I think they have to take on that risk. However, I'm beginning to think that it is reasonable for those of us who have done this to encourage them. And I've heard Douglas Murray, for example, tell people that they should be brave. And I think it wouldn't be bravery if it wasn't about a real risk. It is about a real risk, but there's so much at stake that, yes, it is time. People need to stand up. Bad things will happen, and there are no guarantees. But the problem is, if we don't do that, the game theory tells us where we're going, and it's nowhere good.
I guess I would add to that with regard to being brave. It's much easier if you know for sure that someone has your back. And so in part, Bret and I survived what we did because we knew 100% from the beginning that we had each other's back. And so, many people do not have that, and it will be harder. It will be harder if you don't. But it turns out, and I am still certain of this, although I'm less sure of what the numbers are than I was 4 years ago when Evergreen was beginning to blow up internally and before it had blown up externally, that the people creating the chaos, this chaos that is seeping out into everything, into media, into corporations, into big tech, into everything, and that has the potential to overthrow all of the intact systems, the people responsible are still a minority. They are a very vocal, increasingly powerful minority, but it is my deep sense from talking to so many people and from seeing some research as well, that it is the vast majority of people are not interested in cancel culture, are not interested in either of these extremes. And, the extremes on the right, which we aren't hearing nearly as much about now without Trump in power, is a tiny, tiny minority of people who call themselves conservative. And the extremes on the left, we continue to hear about a ton on campuses, especially, I believe is a larger number, but still a tiny minority of people on the left, a tiny minority. And so when that mob, which in the moment is a majority, comes after you and you feel at risk and you feel that you have to be brave in order to stand up to it, if you can imagine all of the people who are yet silent behind you, who may not yet stand up with you, and would that they would, but that know that there is actually a majority of people who don't want this to continue, maybe we can get this to change.
So I would amend that just slightly. I would say the majority don't want it given a better option. And in some sense, this is one of the things that we have learned. We were ejected from, the unthinking part of the left and ejected into a kind of no man's land. But what we found there was a tremendous number of people who are hard to categorize, but who are nonetheless grateful that somebody will tell them the truth, at least as they understand it. So the discovery that given an alternative, if you force people to choose between Fox and the New York Times, they'll do it. But if you give them something that isn't on that menu, something that's higher quality, they'll do that too. And the more of us who innovate in that space, the richer that culture will become.
Fair enough. Here's one that follows along with that, and this is from one of my students in an intro American politics class. I'm going to cry. When a class is open to different ideas, what is the most important thing for one to remember to be educated on both sides of an argument and or different ideas of an issue? Sorry, Logan, I thought I helped. I guess I didn't.
I think we missed one or two of the words. Could you say the question again?
Sure. When a campus isn't open to different ideas, what is the most important thing for one to remember to be educated on both sides of an argument and or different sides of an issue?
Well, I don't know that it is exactly responsive to that question, but I think it is frequently the right thing to do to figure out there is often an unstated position that is assumed out of existence. that when discovered allows you to know where to stand. And so, the truth of bigotry is that all bigotry is bad for whatever entity it is in. If you run a business and you are ignoring some population because of the color of its skin, you are leaving capacity on the table, right? So that means that anti-black discrimination is bad for a company, as is anti-white discrimination. So if what you have is a faction selling one kind of bigotry or another, they are no friend to the organization that they are cajoling. And having discovered that, one is in a position to make an argument which, it's already been spotted, right? If you say, I believe the university needs to be colorblind, you will immediately set off a tripwire, right? Colorblind is a booby trap. You will be told that colorblindness is the problem. But if you know in your mind that that can't possibly be right, that colorblindness is not the same thing as not honoring people's differences. What it is a recognition that structurally these things, a court has to be colorblind. It cannot be fair otherwise. And so the recognition that you have to get past the booby traps, which means understanding that there is a nuanced position that exists somewhere outside of the positions that you will be forced towards, is the key to escaping the trap.
Fair enough. A couple minutes left, so we might as well rip the Band-Aid off. What are your opinions on critical race theory and how it's contributed to your past and current experiences?
Well, first thing to say is that I believe critical race theory had an honorable root. If I understand it correctly, it started as an investigation, actually, of the failure of the colorblindness of courts. And the idea was that there were biases built into our courts, which were resulting in different defendants facing very different challenges. The problem is, and this goes back to the earlier question about theory and studies and the need for a method, the right tools to figure out if there is a bias in your courts are scientific tools, right? You need to look at a bunch of defendants and do a statistical comparison that would reveal a bias of any kind. If you attack the method, because the method sometimes tells you things you don't want to hear, and so you'd rather just get rid of it so you can hear what you want to hear all the time, then you have invalidated the investigation, and nothing that comes from it, even true things you say, aren't justified if they are arrived at through that mechanism. So, could critical race theory be a legitimate investigation of where the biases in civilization are? Of course it could be. But if it's going to insist that the biases are inherently about bigotry that is actively being wielded by people in the system, then it is an invalid mechanism for addressing it. So, in theory, critical race theory could be valid. In practice, it has been anything but in recent times.
It is, in its current instantiation, verificationist. It can only find evidence for its extant suppositions, and that is not how to find truth. And so you cannot know if anything that it states is or is not true, whereas if it was actively trying to falsify what it claimed, you might be able to take its tenets and methods, if they were falsificationist, and learn something from it. But given that that's not how it's operating, it's not going to be revealing of reality.
In fact, it's even maybe beyond verificationist. It is simply circular. It is tautological. It discovers what it asserts, and it leaves no opportunity for anything else. And in fact, it will cancel those who claim something else is possible.
I wonder if, I know we're getting near the end of time, but if I could squeeze in one more question, at least from the list. This is from a student in a class I'm teaching on change in American culture, and she asks, disagreement in some ways is essential to progress because it allows for an important exchange of ideas and accordingly inspires deep reflective thought. Why are some opposed to constructive criticism? And I think that I would just connect that up with what you've been saying, I think through the hour in good part, is that what goes on in higher education doesn't stay in higher education. These are issues that will affect and do affect the country as a whole. And the students asking, how can you have progress without disagreement and constructive criticism? And I guess I would add to that, how can you have a form of self-government, a form of democracy or a republic where there cannot be disagreement and constructive criticism?
I think you and the question answers itself, right? It can't function long term. It will feel good. It's the, well, you've referred to the junkification of everything. It's the fast ideas, version. It's the sort of Disneyfication of thought. We have fast food, we have easy sex, we have fast ideas in the form of this sort of critical race theory and postmodernism and all of the other instantiations that we have on campus. And what it's doing is shutting down discourse and shutting down disagreement. And that, I think, it feels good in the moment. If you now, especially if you do not have access in the rest of your life to a real connection, this person agrees with me. We are all on the same side here. There is something stable in the world. I'm standing on something stable because all of us in this room agree. And it won't prepare you for the rest of the world. No matter how much such ideology spreads on campuses and spreads into media and big tech and all of this, there will be people who are interested in discovering what's true and what's real and what's right. And those people will continue to work towards progress. And so the better prepared you are in college to actually engage ideas that you don't like, that you've never seen before and you don't know if you like or not, the better prepared you will be for the future. And that will require almost certainly some discomfort in the moment, but you will be better for it and actually lead a more productive and, yes, happier life as a result.
It is also, I think, just scrutinizing the question directly, and it's very hard to put this in a nice way, but those who actively pursue a culture in which you cannot offer constructive criticism are telling you that they are not actually interested in progress in the sense that most of us understand that term. They may be interested in advancing a political agenda, but those of us who want to find out what's true and figure out what is the best way for us to achieve values that we share, of course we need a culture that is open to vigorous debate and a competition between ideas. And I would say it is not true that every single person who finds themselves advancing this agenda is hostile to the idea of progress, but those who are not hostile to the idea of progress and yet are advancing these tactics have been persuaded of something false, and the important thing is for us to awaken them to what it is that they have signed up for, because it will not be progress. It will be quite the opposite.
Well, as we come to the end of our time here, I just want to say thank you again for joining us. To the alums that are out there listening to this, as I am a Bucknell alum, our students are great at doing this sort of thing and being able to engage in discussion and debate. And like you said, they will not defect, right? And we have a really good group of students here. So again, thank you for your time. We appreciate the coming to share your perspectives with us. And what's next for you after the Madison program? Where are you guys going?
Well, we do a podcast every week where we have conversations in which we're trying to model just a little bit of what our classrooms were like. And in September of this year, a book that we've been talking about since, at least 10 years ago, I remember talking about it in a comparative anatomy lab with students, is coming out, co-written. It's a hunter-gatherer's guide to the 21st century. And it provides an evolutionary lens for understanding how to live in this hyper-novel world of ours. So we talk about food and sleep and sex and gender and relationships and parenting and childhood and school and being an adult and society. And yes, each one of those topics could be a book unto itself, but we cram it all in there.
A lot going on. Well, that's great. I look forward to seeing it. For everyone, thank you for attending. We have future events. Go to bucknellleaders.org to learn more about our group and learn more about our events. And thank you so much for coming. And we'll talk soon.
Thanks, guys,
Thank
and
you.
good luck.
Good talking with you. Thanks so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Appreciate it.